guys, I think we can start. And I will just start recording now, and then we're good to go. Okay.
Great. Hi, folks. Thanks, everyone, for joining in today. My name is Rachita Taneja. I make the comic Sanitary Panels, and I'm also a trustee at the Internet Freedom Foundation. So if you're joining the call, you probably already know what Internet Freedom Foundation does, but if you don't, we're a digital rights organization that came out of the Save the Internet campaign, which won key victories on net neutrality in India in around 2016, 2017. The organization basically uses various kinds of interventions, whether it's legal or public organizing or community mobilizing, to advocate on very important digital rights issues such as censorship, surveillance, privacy, internet shutdowns, like the ones happening in Kashmir, and net neutrality. So before we start today's conversation, I would just like to make an appeal. If you like the work that the Internet Freedom Foundation is doing, please consider donating. You can become a regular member. You'll have an IFF membership card as well. So it's internetfreedom.in/donate. So yeah. So our conversation today is on activating virtual spaces for collaboration and activism. So how do we focus on online spaces to assemble and to demand rights? But before we start that, we have Kruttika Susarla, an illustrator, designer, and one of my favorite comic artists who makes this amazing political comic called Politics. And we have Dr. Padmini Murray, an independent researcher and founder of Design Beku, a collective that is doing exciting work in exploring technology and design. So if we could have like a short introduction, Kruttika and Padmini, if you would like to take us through your work. Kruttika, would you like to go first?
My presentation.
Kruttika, I've just given you presenter access.
Oh, should I load it now? Or
I've uploaded it. You should be able to see it. Go to upload a presentation and it's listed there.
Sure. Great. So hi everyone, I am Kruttika. I'm an illustrator and graphic designer based in New Delhi. And over the past few years, I've worked with various organizations in the social sector to help them visualize their campaigns or the advocacy work they're doing. I'll quickly take you through a few examples. I've only included 2 commission projects and 2 personal projects because a lot of my work is already documented with context on my website. So this is a project I worked on last year with an organization in collaboration with Barefoot College. They have a campus in Tilonia in Rajasthan where they train women in all sorts of skill development, one of which is building solar panels. They also provide education, healthcare, and drinking water. So last year they commissioned me to work on a few comics they'd written explaining the concept of fundamental rights granted under the Indian Constitution. So these stories, the stories for these comics came from extensive interviews and research that the people working at Barefoot had done with the women. They'd collected them over the years. And some of these comics were also converted into short animated films by Akhila Krishnan, to be used in workshops and trainings with these women. So this first one is about the right to equality. Then this one's about rights against violence, and there were a few other comics about the right to education, right to health, and one that generally gives an overview of fundamental rights, and they were both in Hindi and English. And I think the aim is to also translate it to other Indian languages. So the next one is actually an ongoing project with Smashboard, which is like a feminist social network. They also provide help and resources to women who are survivors of sexual violence. So I'm working with Soumya, who's a researcher on the prison history in India and also like the general carceral state. So I've worked on illustrating 3 parts of a potentially 5 series comic. And like in the first 3 parts, we've looked at addressing things like selective outrage in cases of sexual violence, especially like in cases of like when violence is committed by I think powerful upper caste men or against marginalized women, it's almost absent. Like public outrage is absent, which is what Soumya has written about in parts 1 and 2. And in part 3, the comic talks about forgotten cases and impunity when it comes to like army committing these violences. For example, in Kunan Pashpora in Kashmir and Afspa in Manipur. So these are my commission projects. Moving on to personal work, I've been making sporadic comics on topical issues under politics. So this one was when India enforced a lockdown and cut off internet in Kashmir last year, and this one was during the Howdy movement. Trump said something about our journalists in the US. Again, I've only included 2, but like all of my comics are on my website and Instagram if you're interested. So a couple of us during the so during the CA and RC protests, and so in Delhi, a couple of us kind of collectivized to work on material for the protest. But like, of course, we know that the protests were kind of shut down by the police here. We decided to kind of continue working together, read together, and also make art about working class issues. So this one's about the recent rollback of labor laws. So the first one kind of looks at all the struggles in the past that led to workers' rights as they exist right now. And the one on top, which is actually the second part, is it talks about why the rollback of laws is dangerous and what could have been done instead. So the group says artists, but actually there are lots of people who are working on environmental issues, policy. There are also lawyers and people working on labor rights. So that there's actually been like a lot of learning from me. And finally, I want to show you some sketch notes. This one's actually from an event that IFF organized last year on the anniversary of the Kruttika judgment, which basically recognizes privacy as a fundamental right. I like attending these events and seminars because I find them useful. Like they help me see connections between various issues I address through my work. The right to privacy is, of course, an argument that was used in the ruling on Aadhaar. As we all know, it's supposed to be voluntary, but we know that's not the case. And again, Aadhaar is supposed to be a government ID, but it's actually a database and also like the foundation for the surveillance state. And the surveillance state affects some of the most like marginalized groups, one of which is trans women. This one's from a press conference held by trans rights activists right after the disastrous transgender persons bill was passed last year. Yeah, I mean, that's some of my work.
Kruttika, Padmini, would you like to go?
Sure. Hi, it's great to be here, and I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. We have slight hiccup with presentation material, so I'll just keep talking, and if Shivani manages to triumph over technology, we'll be able to see something. So I guess I'm an academic researcher by training, and I moved from literary studies into a space called digital humanities. The digital humanities is basically kind of using the idea of computational methods and technologies to prize open kind of humanities and social sciences questions, kind of based on what we can do with computational work, which we weren't capable of doing before. So that's my background, and I came to India and Shrishti, the School of Design, in 2015 to start a master's program, to actually establish a master's program in digital humanities there, and it was super exciting for me because I'd been in the UK for a while, and I think the kind of university system is quite conservative in many ways. And so there wasn't really much space to do interdisciplinary work. And my work kind of, at least my research kind of spanned things like video games, comic studies, digital humanities. And so coming to Shrishti was quite exciting because it's a very interdisciplinary space. And there, as a consequence of working with a lot of people who teach in design, who might not necessarily be trained as designers, but are kind of working with that sensibility, I kind of realized that obviously design and technology is completely intertwined, and the way that kind of technological objects are mediated to us is through design. Right, so there's obviously a politics of design in and of itself. I think increasingly there's a lot of conversation about how technology is political, but I think we still need to have or go a long way in terms of looking at how design is political. And I think in India, obviously those conversations are still quite nascent, and those conversations are far more wide-ranging than we can even imagine, just because of the various demographics of people who use technology now. So as a consequence, I realized that there's a certain kind of techno-utopian Silicon Valley led kind of philosophy around how you create technological objects, which is kind of very like, you throw technology at something and it will solve kind of large problems. And I think, just my dissatisfaction with that, and also the fact that these kind of investigations or these kind of ways of thinking of technology don't take into account the context of so many in this country, made me kind of think about how else we could do this. So I decided that I would found a collective called Design Beku. We were very keen for it to not be a company or a kind of organization per se, because what we really want to encourage is for people to just come in, work with us, and leave on a, they can stay for a project or they can bring a project, and kind of we can work together under the aegis of Design Beku. So you can find out more about Design Beku at designbeku.in. So we're a design and technology collective, and we work in a range of spaces. I think we're still quite new, so a lot of the spaces are to do with we're learning spaces that we think that we can work in. So I think in the recent COVID, kind of as a response to COVID, we created a lot of public health material, so kind of informational material. And I think what was exciting for us is that we tried to explore different illustration styles and different delivery styles than your kind of quite, I guess we now have a kind of homogeneous visual vocabulary because we're all on the internet and we all use certain kind of icons, for example. And I think we forget that a lot of that visual vocabulary is actually quite alien to a lot of people in kind of non-urban contexts, non-English speaking contexts. So what we try to do, and if you go to our website and look at the COVID-19 response, you'll see that there's a kind of a number of illustrations, animations that kind of attempt to make things like wash your hands and observe distancing, etc., but to make it more accessible in terms of illustration and more conversational. So we know that a lot of people have been using this material in NGOs, etc., across the country and in different kind of contexts as well, and that's been really kind of fulfilling because I think we've had really good feedback. People have said to us that they've actually found this material to be a lot more kind of, it spoke to them in a way that kind of your flat vector illustration material necessarily wouldn't. Another space in which we work is in that of digital rights. So for us, I think what we're very keen to do is to demystify digital rights for everybody who uses technology, right? So, for example, there's a lot of conversation, obviously, around consent and privacy, but how people actually, the mental models by which actually people conceive of consent and privacy are not at all kind of in keeping with how we think of consent and privacy. So we're kind of exploring kind of what it means to illustrate terms and conditions, what it means to think about it in different linguistic registers, in order to kind of expand that conversation. So a recent example of this, and this is the presentation I didn't upload. I wrote a piece for EPW on the recent data protection bill, and obviously, for a lot of people, the intricacies of this kind of conversation can be a little daunting. Especially if you're not kind of like in the space. So what we try to do is kind of illustrate the consequences of the data protection bill. So my kind of central argument in the essay was, and this essay came out in EPW. You can Google it. It's part of EPW Engage. And my central argument basically was that even though the data protection bill claims to make all of these kind of ways of accessing your own data simple. It says, oh, you can use the consent manager and find out about your data and then tell people that, oh, you can't use my data, etc., etc. Obviously, that's not the way that your average person engages with their data. They don't even know half the time where it's being used, how it's being used, and it puts the whole responsibility of looking after your data on the individual. So that's a process that we call responsibilization. So we created a speculative comic. This was with my colleague, Paul Anthony George, who also works at Design Bakery with me. We created a speculative comic which was seeing this man through the eyes of his 8-year-old, and basically this man is wearing an invisibility mundu, which is basically, I guess, it's a metaphor for saying, what happens when you're not on the grid, and then what happens when you're forced to be on the grid, and but you don't fulfill criteria, you can't understand what a EULA is, and how, basically not being part of, as Kruttika was saying, not being part of that state database, how that kind of basically means that you become personal non grata in eyes of the state. So we try and kind of make these conversations about digital rights more accessible, hopefully, and and we do a kind of range of other work, kind of just in terms of working around user ethics as well. So I think in design we've had very little conversation about ethics for how we do research with our users. It can often be quite exploitative. So in academic contexts, we definitely have to fulfill certain criteria to do so, to do that research, but we don't have any industry standards. So you can be doing, say, research on fintech, and get a lot of data from people who might not necessarily understand the implications of giving away their data, and that is still okay. So we're also, okay, we have a presentation. So I don't know if I can, let's see if I can. Yeah, okay, great, thanks, Shivani. Can you go to just keep scrolling through? Okay, never mind. We can have a look at this later if we have time. But yeah, that's enough now to maybe get a sense of the work we do. Thanks.
Thanks, Padmini. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you short. I was thinking we could get into the discussion, but I'm sure people will have questions as well. So let's get into the reason why we're here. So what does it mean? This is a question for the both of you, and I'll chime in as well at some point. But what does it mean to assemble online and demand for our rights? Basically, what we're talking about here today.
Should I go first, or? I think it looks very different depending on what the objective of the art is or what we're campaigning for. Sometimes it could mean directing people to protest, helping people who are already on the ground collectivize and mobilize more people. Sometimes it means directing people to sign petitions when it's needed, and also maybe directing people to mutual aid funds, which we've seen a lot of during the lockdown period, whether it is to help migrant workers reach their homes or raising funds for people whose jobs are dependent on being out. It's also for me, I think it's also working with organizations or people who are already campaigning for things you align with or want to talk about, and organizations that could probably use the help of art to amplify their work online.
Yeah, so I have I have a slightly ambivalent relationship with with kind of gathering online. So there are some very useful ways in which we can use technology to mobilize for protests, right? Like, so, and mobilize being the key word there. Obviously, kind of mobilization over Instagram or WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever, obviously gives us great reach. It obviously means that we can kind of coordinate in ways that was just completely impossible before. And I think that is incredibly useful. However, I do feel that protest itself online is somewhat compromised because it's always on a platform. And corporate platforms, corporate technology platforms have obviously kind of algorithmic kind of preferences and tactics built in, which means that many times a lot of conversations can be sidelined, can be not visible. And there's a kind of inherent contradiction, at least to my mind, to kind of using platforms for protest. I think also, unfortunately, because it reveals it reveals your hand in a sense. What it means is that it can also kind of open you up to violence. So we see this all the time, say on Twitter. So conversations cannot be had in in a civilized way because it immediately kind of degenerates into trolling or sea lining. And so the affordances of the platforms that keep us on the platforms are the very affordances that can be damaging to protest. So I think while there are some really good things about having technology to mobilize and amplify, I feel like that is definitely something that we have to contend with as well.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely because I find myself often limiting or changing my style depending on the platform that I'm about to post on. So the platform is kind of dictating what I'm doing, whether consciously or subconsciously. I'm going to want to make sure it is shorter or, even something as silly as it being square and it filling in, it looking good on a grid. So it is going to dictate what we're going to say and what we're going to do, which means it comes with its own biases. But I've noticed that the Black Lives Matter movement is doing a really good job of using the platforms that we have currently, which, yes, are limiting. But I'm seeing that they are being extremely effective online. They're using different tactics and across different platforms. So is there something that we can learn from them in that way, that they're taking advantage of the platforms that we have?
Sure. I think the Black Lives Matter movement was also one of the first movements in the past decade to kind of effectively use the internet as a catalyst. Like, I think it began around 2014. But I feel that the scale at which it happened and is happening right now has also been possible because of a strong on-ground presence, large demonstrations and sit-ins. And we've also seen that with the CA and RC protests, I mean. But what has struck me about the Black Lives Matter movement this time around is how quickly or how willingly radical thought seems to have entered the mainstream. Like, they're talking about defunding the police and abolishing prisons and police. We don't know if it'll happen, but it's great. It's a great benchmark to have. They're also talking about, I think people on social media are also reinforcing the importance of centering the movement around Black trans women who are subject to a lot of violence, and that's amazing because like the art that's coming out of the movement is also responding to exactly this, I feel, because more often than not, like when we react to social issues or movements online, like sometimes the art tends to sensationalize pain, or somehow the talking point comes from a place of guilt or pity. But I think we should talk about something because it's the right thing to do. Because only by centering these like very vulnerable lives will all of us be truly liberated, right? And I think the Black Lives Matter movement is doing an excellent job of that. Like, in like coming back to India, like recently in Safura's case, for example, I think at some point the talking point became about the fact that she's pregnant, which I guess was to gain public sympathy, and it is valid that she's pregnant and she should not suffer, but that alone is not the merit of the argument for her release. Like she was really not doing anything wrong. So I think it would have been ideal to see a lot of art critiquing the system that allowed for something like this to happen in the first place, including the Bhima Koregaon activists, and more recently Scroll's editor having a FIR slapped because they wrote about Dalit issues in Varanasi. I think the scale at which it's happening is very shocking. So I think the lesson for me has been like to learn how to be extremely critical and very deliberate in the kind of art we're making and the kind of language we're using, because the quality of the argument we're making really matters, so as to not dilute the movement.
Yeah, I think is very that the Black Lives Matter movement has asked for what they want, right? Like, it's not like they're being incrementalist about it. They have just gone and said, we want to defund the police. And that's a very strong message to go out with. And artists and activists and everyone is basically asking or pushing for that one message, which I think is really strong. And I think that in India, the right has been able to use that kind of messaging really well, like the extreme messaging. And we are still trying to like toe the line and be more conservative with how radical we want to go with our messages. So for example, and I mean, yeah, I would give the example of Free Kashmir, like saying Free Kashmir should not be something that you get an FIR for. Like if there is a woman holding a Free Kashmir sign at a protest, whether it's CA or any other protest, it's something that should be allowed. Like now it's being weaponized in the media that, saying Free Kashmir is now automatically means that you're anti-national. So I think that the messaging is really important, saying exactly what you mean and going for what you want at the end of the day, not what you think would be incremental or acceptable right now. Sorry, that was a very winded answer, but yeah, I think language is important. Padmini, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues is language. So after all, the Black Lives Matter movement is under the banner of English, and that is just makes it so much stronger. If we want to kind of accurately represent all the various, even intersecting struggles in this country, language is a huge divide, right? And it's also like how we think about vernacular, say, media or imagery. Like, so, TikTok, for example, is a very different space from, say, Facebook or Instagram and Twitter. And so I feel like there's a definite fragmentation as to kind of what we have as a defining aesthetic for the movement. The defining aesthetic for the right is obviously just bludgeon everybody and be terrible. But for the left, and I think this is always going to be a problem for the left, because there's always some kind of element of, we do not want to resort to that. So, so how do we still have a kind of united and representative voice? And I think, as Kruttika said, I mean, of course, to center the conversation on the most vulnerable is probably the best way forward. But unfortunately, that, at least I think in our country, one of the major reasons why that's difficult is it also kind of can slip into, are we going to, kind of work, kind of focus on Dalit women or on Muslim women? I mean, I think with Safura, that's something that's come up time and time and again, with people who have been unfairly jailed under UFA, there's so many kind of issues actually that it's really, I mean, of course, they're all, I mean, the response is obviously Antifa, but like, it's very difficult to kind of capture, all of that under one banner. So, but I do think, just quickly, Rachita, just going back to what you were saying about tactics, I do think that is something that can be used in a much more exciting way. So, like, one of my favorite things that BLM did was when they were using YouTube. So you could just keep a video on for like an hour. You didn't even have to watch the video. I mean, the video was a kind of a compilation of Black artists performing, and if you wanted to, you could watch it. If you didn't want to, you didn't. But it was on in the background. You lifted ad block and you raised money, basically through doing that, right? Like, so basically, they were kind of using the fact that you can kind of make money as a creator of YouTube and kind of using that to fundraise. And so you could just watch that video again and again and again and raise money. And I think it was like super smart. I think also the whole controversy around the black squares, so there was obviously the slightly misguided attempt to draw attention to the movement by people using black squares, and a lot of activists were obviously saying that that's kind of obliterating or erasing rather than kind of amplifying. But then what happened was a lot of activists had started tagging it with Trump women and kind of things like that, and kind of completely subverted. So I actually do think there's some element of public education that's also not public education, but just education about how the internet works in order for us to do these things more efficiently. Like, it's not enough to have a Twitter storm, or it's to use a hashtag, because I think we are now beyond that. Like, we have to kind of be more imaginative, and also kind of think about interesting ways in which to link the online and the offline. So I kind of think that there are ways, like say just using Bluetooth in protest spaces, things like that. So I think there are ways that we can learn, definitely, but we need to probably have people more aware of how these things work in order to kind of be able to optimize them.
It would be very interesting to see what about the Black Lives Matter movement can be, brought onto our anti-CAA stuff, for example, because there are a lot of parallels, like tipping point, etc. So one of the things that obviously we have to recognize is that the most vulnerable people who are most likely to be at a disadvantage because of the human rights violations that we're getting left, right, and center these days, is that they might not have access to the internet. The most vulnerable people will not have access to the internet, not have access to the platforms or the language that we're speaking in. So how do we use our platforms as artists? Like, I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, they've done it really, really well. They have, like, for example, white allies have stepped back completely and said, you lead, we will, just protect you with our bodies, for example. So how do we do that with our platforms in India? How do we, without grabbing the mic from them? Either one of you, whoever is happy to.
So speaking to this from an Indian context, and to be very honest, I don't know the answer for this, especially if you're talking about people who don't have access to the internet. I think I'm also trying to figure out. But from my point of view, and I might be entirely wrong, but I think people who are vulnerable are already fighting, or they know how to fight and demand their rights. So the way I think of this is, or the way I think of these things when I make political art is, this is really for all of us who are disconnected or ignorant about these realities, if that makes sense. And if that answers the question exactly, but that's my thought process.
Yeah, I think as Kruttika says, a lot of this is about awareness raising and educating, right? I think there are so many narratives that are simultaneously unfolding in India that it is actually quite impossible to kind of have, and it also, I think, it leads to a kind of fatigue that there's how many things can I be invested in, how many things can I help with, and I think say what's recently happened, which for me I find is really interesting, like this absolutely amazing civil society response to the lockdown and how migrants were treated as a consequence of the lockdown. But that is definitely, it's not a sustainable response, right? How much can people keep funding? And basically what it does, actually, it enables the system, because it's not actually kind of challenging the government and kind of on their lack of delivering what they're meant to deliver, what taxes are paid for, what a democratic government is supposed to do. So I think some ways in which we can help is to kind of use channels to kind of prize open infrastructure, to prize open the way in which things work that are often quite nefarious. So using RTIs, for example, basically kind of getting to the bottom of things that are kind of affecting the disenfranchised, and to see how we can use privilege to move against that. So, access to legal help, education, so on and so forth. So, I don't know how much, as like Kruttika, even I'm not kind of quite sure whether the internet, I mean, of course, it makes a difference, and having access to the internet, does give you somewhat of a voice. But I think people are, and as again Kruttika rightly said, I think people are doing already what they want to do. Like if they have the internet, they're say making TikTok videos or using WhatsApp, or kind of being able to mobilize using those things. And if they're not, I think they are already doing what they've done for years and centuries. And I think it's on us to be proactive to see how we can intervene in kind of lending infrastructural support or any other kind of support, not only financial.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your point about the fact that we're not fighting for systemic change, which would enable migrant workers to have access to resources that they should be getting anyway. But we're it's like a band-aid on a broken foot or something. So I think that's very important. And a lot of the art that we have created recently has been about raising funds for relief work. But I mean, how are we prioritizing? Because it is important to be reactive, but it is also important to be proactive. So we want to proactively ask the government to do its job, but we also, in the meanwhile, know that there are lives at stake and we need to raise funds for that. So how do we manage these two? Because even like, for example, when a natural disaster happens, there is a question about immediately needing to save people's lives, but there is also, why was this infrastructure built in such a way that it was affected so badly, or that so many people had to face what they faced? So how do we manage the reactive and proactiveness of our work? Because I see us often responding to attacks nonstop, where we're constantly attacked and we have to keep reacting. You can go.
So I feel like this is a two-part question. One is like how to prioritize when there are so many things, like how do we prioritize which one to talk about and which one to react to? And I think it's fair to say that as an individual, like it's very complicated to prioritize which one to talk about or which issues to talk about first, because during the lockdown or even before that, there have been a lot of things that have happened, like the Kashmir lockdown and the shutting down of the internet there, the death penalty in case of the Nirbhaya verdict, and the CAA and RC protests, of course, and how it got squashed, unfortunately, because of the pandemic and the surveillance state, the migrant labor crisis, and like raising of the funds, like you're saying, farmers, how they've just gotten no relief at all, and the environmental impact assessment bill. And these are issues that have been reported in the media, and there are obviously like lots of things that we don't know that are not getting reported, and like we are reacting to these headlines, right? And it is inevitable that some issues will feel more urgent than the others, depending on, again, our own biases, what we strongly feel about, how the media is covering them, and what the public sentiment at the time is like. So I feel like the way I kind of work around this is a more pragmatic way of doing this is probably thinking about what we want to campaign for, and really like spend some time in reading and educating ourselves about it. Like, and instead of just reacting to the headline, maybe add to the conversation that talks about the structures that led to these things being in place first, if that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, like, and the other thing is to also reach out to people or organizations or unions that are already doing this work at some level, and they probably have solutions to, how to fight these things, but their work is probably not online, and maybe reach out to them and see if they need help in putting this up online and amplifying their work online. And I've seen that, like, I feel like I've learned how to do that, and I've had the opportunity to do that through Artists for Progressive Politics a little bit.
Yeah, I think again, I think I do really agree with Kruttika that educating oneself is actually one of the biggest keys to it. I mean, it kind of sounds very worthy and honest, but I think we can only actually begin to help in meaningful ways if we educate ourselves. And I think the other thing is just to kind of accept that we can't solve everything. We can't be a part of every struggle, and that these struggles are intersectional, right? So, so at Design Baker, one of the things that we are very keen to observe is that we work in a sustained fashion with a community, and so my colleague Shreyas has been working in North Karnataka for many years now, and we have a kind of a working relationship of trust, of an understanding of what we can do with that community, for that community. And I kind of feel like that, to my mind, is actually possibly more productive than us trying to kind of spread ourselves across many kind of problems or issues with which we don't necessarily have a fully nuanced understanding, right? So I think, I think the tendency, obviously, because of social media and the way that this kind of content also gets coverage on social media, is bombarded with all of these kind of issues, and of course, I mean, any sensitive person will be like, okay, what do I do? But I think that what do I do has to actually be kind of maybe rolled back a little to what can I do effectively in an optimized way. Because people, I mean, time, I think we don't talk enough about time poverty in activism, right? Like, how much time that you allot to different kinds of activism, and all of it does take time. So how do you kind of allot or kind of apportion that? So I think for me, at least, or for us at Design Group, I think it's very much about kind of working deep dive sustainably with one community whose challenges they know the best, and to ask, what do you need? What do you need from us that helps? And then to kind of step in.
Yeah, I think I really enjoy making comics for issues that I know that a campaigning organization, I think Kruttika said this before, there's a campaigning organization working, for example, on environmental protections, and to make sure that they are not diluted. So if I make comics for them so that they can get more people to send an email to the ministry, I know somehow that my work is having a real impact. Whereas when I'm doing something that is not as connected or not as like call to action-y, then I don't know whether I am successfully making any changing any minds, because again, we're in our bubbles. Am I affecting change in that way? One interesting thing, Kruttika, that you said about the APC, the Artists for Progressive APP, Progressive Politics, yes, sorry, is that it would be interesting to have a kind of formal, semi-formal setup where we can like play tag team almost. So for example, if an organization needs art for a report, which no one will read unless there is art with it, because it's sad but true that if you have a lot of if it's wordy, it's less likely to be read, or if it's not publicized in a flashy way. So it would be interesting to have a system where we can play tag team and say, hey, we need an artist to make this right now. Who is free? Who can do this for us? I don't know. Just a random thought I had while we were talking about this.
I mean, like, not just make people read the content, but also hopefully change their opinion on something. Take them through an experience that changes their opinion on a particular issue or topic, and hopefully, like, that's what we're trying to do through this collaboration.
Absolutely. Yeah, with the collab, I think having like a pool of artists and saying, okay, I am busy, I can't do this right now, but there is this other person who is happy to step in and make your content more accessible or more exciting. And so one of the last questions that I'll ask before we go into taking questions from the participants is that there is a lot of fatigue with sad content online. Like everyone is going through a collective lull, right? We're all going through different variation, different levels of being depressed, I guess. And there are people who are going to start switching off of social media content that reinforces that sadness, that reminds them that shit, there is something bad that's happening in the world and I feel powerless and hopeless and I can't do anything about it. So this is a question that I've been asking myself. How do I make my content not want people to switch off? Like my content might make people feel intimidated or sad or scared or hopeless because they feel like it's overwhelming and that there's too much to digest. So how do we make sure people don't switch off and continue sort of engaging in a sustainable way?
I feel like how people react to the news or what we make, like the art is not really in our hands at some level. Like, I mean, people are making these decisions themselves, and like Padmini also said before, like there are obviously, like, everyone's first response is to be like, oh, this is sad and how can I help, and like at some level people are doing this kind of filtering on their own, like what they want to read about and help with. And yeah, like I feel like it's impossible for me to talk about every single thing that's happening because it also affects me. Like I also get sad, and if I'm angry or confused or I'm unsure about why something is happening, I feel like I'd rather take a step back, not share anything, and think about what my opinion on this is, or like what I want to say about this, and really think about if the art that I'm going to make and put out is actually going to help someone or add to the conversation, or if it's just going to add to the anxiety that people are already overwhelmed with. And I feel like it's important to also make these decisions sometimes. Like we don't have to do that.
Yeah, I think one way to kind of think about it is that there are, I know it seems not to be the case, but there are inspirational stories happening all the time, right? I think it's also how we kind of draw on reserves of resilience to think about what can be done or what people are doing. And I think it doesn't have to be of great magnitude. I mean, I think really small stories are really, really important and kind of inspiring. And I think that's one way, I think, to kind of maybe kind of interrupt the the bad news cycle. But I also feel, I think that self-care is also important, and as Kruttika was saying, I think the onus shouldn't necessarily always be on the artist to kind of be like, how do I now kind of make my audience not fall into a well of depression? Because I think there is obviously, these are the times we live in. But I think, again, educating is a key space that one can shift one tenor, right, and kind of into that space. And also maybe I think people do feel more empowered by definite call to action. So if they feel like, okay, I can do this, and that could even be reading a book about Dalit feminism, but that can I think makes people feel more like they're doing something. So.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a great point. Giving people something concrete to do will make them at least feel like they have some control over a situation which seems right now to be running out of their hands. Cool. These were the questions that I had. I'm happy to take questions. I mean, all of us are happy to take questions from the chat. So Shruti asks, yeah, I mean, Kruttika, Padmini, if you want to read and respond to it, because everyone can see the questions. So maybe we can take a second to read and whoever feels moved to respond.
So the first question about two kinds of art online, one which informs the audience, the other incites some emotion. Personally, have had trouble reconciling my art with either of these kind of arts. Is there some middle ground? I don't know if there's a middle ground. I think that we need like a mix of strategies, like invoking emotions, dissenting against the state, and that is one kind of strategy, but also like informing audience or changing someone's, educating art that is educating audience about something is also important. So I don't know if like middle ground is the right word for this. I just think that they're two different things, and like we need like a little bit of both.
Um, So if I can just respond to Shruti's question. So Shruti is asking something that I find problematic with social media activism is the lack of a whole context with a post or story that disappears in 24 hours. It doesn't give enough time to really engage with the context and understand and digest the information. So in an atmosphere when we're flooded with so much information, how can we better engage productively? So this for me, so I'm very glad that somebody asked this question because this is a question that I'm quite obsessed with. So I completely agree. I do think that the ephemerality of social media, as I said at the very outset, I think that it does compromise protest in some way, and thus my obsession with archiving and archives. So I think I have been ranting about this for a while that social media content can and will be taken down by anybody, be that the government, be that the technology corporation itself, and it's so important to archive what we put out. I know it's a very boring kind of unsexy thing to do, but it's important because it's history. It's actual history. Like I think for me, the key moment when I realized this was after Rohit Vemula's death. There was such an amazing kind of just kind of outpouring of thinking and writing and protest from the Dalit community on Facebook, and so much of that is now gone. And I think Dalit history has constantly been overwritten and omitted in kind of our kind of ideas about, say, student protest or historical protest, and it just to me seems like a huge shame. So yeah, I think archiving is very important, and also proactively making databases of this information. So something that I'm concerned about is that, say, Instagram, which is used and is being used very effectively to campaign for environmental justice. Even like I personally feel that every day I hear about something like the Debang Valley or whatever, and then but they're not, the resources are not in one place. So like we actually need to proactively build databases of things that we learn in order to interact with them. It feels like more work, but I think it is more necessary because social media and always will be.
I think that archiving is actually one of the proactive things that we can do, in terms of making, instead of, it's like, as opposed to being reactive, archiving is a very proactive way to try to sustain a movement. So yeah, I really like that point. Vishaka's question, how to prevent ourselves from getting into an echo chamber protest-wise. So this is a very important question, and I think Padmini, you're best placed to speak about the biases that come with the platforms and the work that you're doing on design.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm being like the voice of doom, but I don't think it's actually possible, unfortunately. Just the way that's how social media is built, because it's a corporation and that's how they could make money. It's just as simple as that. So I have written about this idea of what I call algorithmic violence, which is that basically starting from search, starting from Google search to social media platforms, we're constantly being kind of ushered into these echo chambers that we have no way of escaping. And so I think that's actually, this is where protest gets hard, that we can't rely on social media to be the only space where we enact protests. There is also the rest of the internet. I think this is also interesting that we don't talk about websites anymore. Like, it's just, it's internet is equal to social media. And I think that's really worrying. Like, there's, if anybody has time, like there's a brilliant art piece, activism piece called Wages for Facebook, which is basically saying that we are all laborers for Facebook, so we should be paid. and it's an interactive art piece, which is a website, standalone website. So I just kind of feel like we need to kind of accept that these are corporate platforms, that they are going to not make it easier for us to protest them. So.
Yeah, so when the net neutrality movement was happening, when the Save the Internet campaign was at its peak, Facebook wanted to introduce free basics in India, which was basically like a walled garden internet, and that violated net neutrality. And so the reason that we were worried about, the reason that so many of us were so worried about it was because then the internet would become Facebook. So for someone who is just getting on the internet for the first time, for them, if they are using free basics, then the internet is basically Facebook for them, which is a very dangerous concept, which is what Facebook is trying to do, which is like initially they had termed free basics internet.org. And I think they were just trying to redefine themselves as the internet. So it's great that we won that fight. Deepthi has asked a question. I'll just scroll up while.
I think Kruttika from YouTube, not me, another Kruttika, has asked a question that Rachita, I think you should answer probably. Considering how certain artists are targeted by commenters as being urban Naxal or community, to what degree does fear of takedown or blocking of the profile of that artist?
So yeah, so I've had an experience with my content being taken down, and so there in my mind when some content gets censored, I have two options. One is to make like a big thing about it, a big ruckus about it, so that on different platforms. So like if something gets taken down on Instagram, I will go on Twitter and start tagging Twitter, and then have my followers tag Instagram and ask them why they've taken that content down. So in one case, it actually worked. I was talking about how Facebook and Instagram have very bad community standards when it comes to protecting women from abusive language, but they are very quick to shut down comments like "men are trash." So I was making a comic mocking the hypocrisy. And so they took that post down, funnily enough. A post about community standards was taken down because it violated community standards. And then within, I was able to get some media attention around it. Scroll did an article, Deccan Herald did an article. Mirror Now, I was on a very short segment in Mirror Now talking about it as well. So it was reposted. They put it back like nothing ever happened. And they didn't say anything to me. They didn't alert me about it being put back. So yeah, the threat is definitely there. But honestly, if the maximum they're doing is taking down or blocking my profile, I'm going to be happy with that. And I think there are ways to like put pressure on them. Like I would treat it as just another campaign. So they have censored me, like they would censor, say, a journalist or someone else. And so you put pressure on the platform, and it helps to have a following. Sadly, it does help to have a following. You're less likely to be censored if you have that blue tick or if you have 50,000 followers on a platform. So I've got that going for me. Kruttika, have you faced any comics or any work of yours being taken down?
No, I mean, like, I don't think any of my work has been taken down, but there is like the usual right-wing trolling on Instagram. But on Twitter, I think Rachita, I shared this with you, but like, I recently got added to this list, I think, which is supposed to be for like targeted trolling. And like the name of the list is really funny. It's called Hindus in Name Only. And like, that was kind of the first time I discovered this terminology. I mean, I guess it's scary, but like there are people who are doing far more important work, and yeah, like if they're fine. I don't think I'm really on their radar.
Yeah, I mean, on Twitter also, for example, like there are these certain profiles that have started filing FIRs or trying to file FIRs against me, and then you can make a cyber complaint very easily on the internet. So there are I think some 20-30 people have tried to file the cyber complaints against me online. So that's the thing, like blocking or taking down would be very easy to deal with as compared to some legal implication, because that's something that's a longer term thing and much more difficult to deal with. I think we have about 10 more minutes. Kruttika, Padmini, if you would like to take some more questions, and then we can have like closing comments if there are any.
I think there's one question about designer art being heavily skewed towards English-speaking population and mainstream issues. What would be a potential way forward to actually make art activism rooted in regional languages and thereby accommodating of the hyper-local context? And that's a great question. I think, so I have been trying to make my comics in English and Telugu, which is my mother tongue. And I think the kind of audience I've received on my Instagram has also changed since I've been doing that. And it's also like helped me engage with politics in Andhra and Telangana. But I think speaking of art activism being rooted in regional languages or hyper-local contexts is again like going back to what we were discussing about just going out and reaching out to organizations, like maybe just like reach out to like a school in your city or town and like see what their issues are, and like, you know, if you are interested, just see how you can help them. Like that is one direct way to engage in hyper local issues.
So I actually have two things to say to this. So one, absolutely yes. The English, it's very very skewed towards English speaking population, and I'm super guilty of continuing taking it there. But one of the things that I noticed during the CA protests was that I had a comic which had no words in it. It was just symbols. The entire thing was just symbols, and it was the most viral comic I have ever had. Not only was it the most viral comic online, but even offline, people were replicating the comic. It was 4 panels about a person putting a fist up, the fist being hit by a police lathi, the person falling, and then 5 or 6 more people rising with their fists up. There were no words in it. And the reason, like now I know that the reason it did so well was because it did not need words. It translated into every language. So I think I've taken that and kept that in mind to see, can I make wordless comics that are just using symbols that we all know and are used to. That's one. And the second thing, like Kruttika is actively translating her comic in another language as well. Not translating, sorry, making her comic in another language. I think that with sanitary panels, I haven't been able to do that, and I don't think I would do a good job at it necessarily, but I have had requests of people asking me if they can edit my comic and, you know, put their preferred language on top of it. And I'm like, yeah, go for it. Absolutely. As long as the meaning is not being skewed in any way. Yeah, and third, like I made another comic very recently about how to correctly wear a mask. Even though it says how to wear a mask on top, you don't actually need the sentence. And so people have been printing out that and putting it on in their office, like, you know, distributing it to people in their office so that everyone who's going to work these days is protected with a mask. So it's really interesting for me to see how I can make my comic without using words, or as few words as possible, which could be easily translated into other languages. Yeah.
So, so I think I'll just respond to Apar's question, which is probably if I knew that, then we'd be triumphant. How do we go beyond kind of hashtags and petition campaigns? So I think what I find interesting about this conversation is that where is the battleground, right? Like, is the battleground within the boundaries of the social media space itself? Like, you know, so say when we have endless conversations trying to persuade somebody about something, you know, is that where the battle is being fought, or, you know, where is the battle being fought, right? And I think unfortunately the battle is being fought, you know, out with these spaces, and the internet can only be a part of that. I mean, it's really funny for me because this is my life's work, you know, working on technology. But I also think that technology is very compromised in its current form, and so I think we can use technology in really smart ways. I think again, you know, we've talked about BLM, but also the Hong Kong protests. I mean, how smartly they use it for coordination, you know, to be water. You know, I mean, those are things to learn, and that again, I think it requires some more engagement with how technology works in order to take it forward. In terms of protest, in terms of making change, I think, I mean, this is going to be such a long haul, and I know that we're already fatigued, but I think unfortunately there's no quick and easy answer. I think just an alertness to the fact that whatever we put online is just a small part of, you know, what needs to happen, I think is crucial, and infrastructural change, and that could be, you know, so we work very closely with an organization called Janastu, who does kind of great grassroots tech, which is just creating technology which is suited completely for their context. So they created this brilliant recording device where, you know, it just has 3 buttons, you know, one to record, one to listen, and one to broadcast. And there, you know, people are archiving their own stories using that. So so I think, yes, we also need to kind of think about, like, expand our conception of what technology is. So that is also hardware, you know, decentralized servers, things like that. So kind of pulling data and, you know, putting it in places that we legislate. Yeah, to me, I think, you know, those are the things that we need to be thinking about.
I think there's one question we missed, which actually like is probably for Padmini. Because it's a long question, but it asks why the resources and documentaries that make the rounds in academic circles are not really available in the mainstream media.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think the problem actually is that the really good and really useful content about, say Dalit content is not happening in mainstream academic circles, because mainstream academic circles have been so eager to keep them out. So I think it's actually a question of, again, of course there are websites that do an amazing job of this, Dalit Camera and Savri and Roundtable, etc. But I think again, a lot of this material, a lot of really good, important writing happens in vernacular languages, and we don't have enough bandwidth to translate. Like, so much amazing stuff happens in like little magazines, for example, and newspapers, community newspapers and magazines. So one interesting discovery I've just made is that there's an organization called Project Setu, who are a voluntary translation corps, and I'm very excited about this because at Design Beku, when we were creating COVID content, we created it in around 6 languages, which was pretty much, we, like the people who were creating content, those are the languages they spoke. But I think there's a great gap that we need people to be translating and then putting stuff out there. So, yeah.
I also just want to say that, for example, Dalit scholars, like Dalit Camera, for example, was censored at a certain point as well. I think their page was taken down, or a video was taken down. So they, non-Savarna platform, not even platforms, but like when non-Savarna groups exist on Facebook or on Twitter, they are more likely to be censored, and we are less likely to hear about it, and we are less likely to have any say in putting it back up.
And there's one last question about licensing. Srinivas has a question about licensing comics. I think it works very differently for commission projects. Usually, like it is very, licensing in commission projects is very specific to the client's need and like how many surfaces it will be used on and how long it will be used on, and if it is a work for hire and things like that. So usually, like the contract with the licensing, like I usually tailor it for every project. But yeah, like if it is for if it is like political art or movements, I assume that it is under a Creative Commons open kind of license. Yeah, that makes sense.
There's a last question.
Rachita, I think you should take that.
Yeah, I'll quickly answer this. I actually just finished reading, or actually listening to a book on audiobooks called Don't Think of an Elephant by George Lakoff, which is, I would recommend everyone read it if you're interested in language and messaging. But it basically says that fighting right-wing propaganda with their language is never going to work. So saying, saying no. Okay, give me an example of right-wing propaganda. There is so much; it's just overwhelming to think about. But when, for example, someone tells you don't think of an elephant, you immediately will think of an elephant. So even when you're saying no elephants allowed, you're still going to be thinking elephants allowed at some point subconsciously. The synapses in your brain are going to say that. So I am trying to understand how language and cognitive science works in that way. How do we perceive messages when we hear them, and not just how we think we perceive messages, but how subconsciously we're actually taking the message in. So actually opposing the right wing regularly is not going to change anything. Framing our own message as to what we want to see in our ideal version of the future is the only way that we're going to have like a sustained movement that's going to build. So for example, with the LGBT movement, we use the language love is love, which is not saying lift the ban on homosexuality, right? So we said love is love, which is why we won the campaign, which is why it came so far, and we were able to change people's perception about how they viewed the issue. So saying love is love made people feel positive, emotional. They were able to relate to the feeling somehow. they were able to see what a future could look like. But saying don't ban don't criminalize homosexuality, you still have the words criminalize homosexuality in them. So, there are these very interesting messaging things that I think we should all pay attention to, or at least like have a vague understanding of when we're putting our words out. And because it might even be irresponsible for us to continue reinforcing the right-wing propaganda when we're trying to fight it even. Anyone have any final thoughts? Anything to say? No? We're good? All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Please consider donating to the Internet Freedom Foundation at the link is right there at IFF Events. And yeah, thank you, Kruttika and Padmini and Shivani for organizing this. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you. It's been awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.